Hello all. This week is Parshat Metzora. It is also Shabbat HaGadol, the Shabbat before Pesach. And we either tend to read either Tzav or Metzora. So these Parshiot about purity and perfection and what we will never achieve and all of that. So I've entitled this talk, Insiders or Outsiders, Who Decides, in honor of that theme. If you love Divrei Torah, and some of you, I've already shared this in other contexts, so you may remember this, you have Rabbi Isaac Bernays, the chief rabbi of Hamburg, Germany, in the first half of the 19th century, to thank. Originally, Divrei Torah were only given on Shabbat HaGadol and Shabbat Shuvah, during the Aseret Yemei Shuvah in the Jewish community. The sermon as such was an import from the outside and other religious traditions that did not include so much text as in Torah reading and the tefillot and the voluminous amount of material that we often achieve or that we go through in our normal services. The sermon was the highlight of these services and these traditions. Bernays was trying to stem the tide of the religiously observant Jews not becoming outsiders in their cultural context, clearly something we're working on today, and maintaining their place in the larger German social and secular community. And therefore he adopted this practice, along with others, including the wearing of canonicals, which we generally do not see anymore, but I certainly remember from my childhood, and I'm sure many of you do as well. These adaptations came from the Christian world, bringing it into the Jewish community as an established practice. And remember, Bernays was what we would call orthodox, was observant. In every way, he was a social reformer, bringing general education, often only available to the wealthier classes, into his Talmud Torah schooling system in 1822. In so many ways, while the name Samson Raphael Hirsch is credited with the beginning of neo-orthodoxy, it was his teacher, Rabbi Isaac Bernays, who really set the tone for the integration of religious and general life as we know it today. So here we are, approaching Shabbat HaGadol, preparing for Pesach, and talking about outsiders in Parshat Metzora. Rabbi Shmuel Rabinowitz writes as follows regarding how we should think about Shabbat HaGadol. The source for this name, mentioned in halachic sources for over 1,000 years, is not known. Various theories have been offered, one of which is the desire to connect this Shabbat to Pesach. Indeed, different traditions in Jewish communities point to this connection. For example, there is a tradition to read the Pesach Haggadah on this Shabbat as preparation for the Seder. There's also a tradition for the rabbi of the community to deliver a sermon on this Shabbat regarding the halachot and the significance of Pesach. It seems not to be coincidental that Shabbat was chosen as the day on which to prepare for Pesach. Shabbat obviously is closely linked to the Exodus from Egypt and therefore to Pesach. As we say in the Kiddush every Friday evening, and with love and favor, God gave God's holy Shabbat as a heritage, a remembrance of the creation. For that day is the prologue to the holy convocations, a remembrance of Yetziat Mitzrayim. As we all think about this event of Yetziat Mitzrayim, it is so important to remember that all members of Bnei Yisrael were included in this event, though not all Jews necessarily left. In fact, we say this as part of our Seder when we enjoin all who to remember that we were involved in this seminal event, not just the generation from long ago. We invite all those who need to do so to come and join our Seder in our words. Do we do this in our deeds? We say the words about every generation, b'chol dor v'dor, remembering the taste of servitude to a human master, and the freedom of that servitude, from that servitude. Do we act in our deeds with such a remembering mindset that we were not freed to become new masters, so to speak? In short, are we welcoming to all and inclusive to the degree that all are welcome and belong as insiders? Or are there still outsiders in our communities today? So now we turn to our Parsha. First of all, look at the word Metzora. Mem, Tzadi, Resh, Ayin. Notice the various words incorporated in it. Narrow straits, Tsar, Mitzrayim. Then there is the root for sorrow or distress, Tsa'ar, Tzadi, Ayin, Resh. And finally the root for stop, Atzor, Ayin, Tzadi, Resh. Same words. Let us think about the various forms of distress associated with this topic and how we have the power to stop it by reintroducing all of us to the total collective of our community. A most worthy thought for this time in our lives of way too much fracture and discord, unfortunately. We learn in Parshat Metzora about the purification process of the one who is afflicted with tzara'at, with the explicit goal of this person who may have done some sins, some misdeeds that were connected to the tzara'at, as we discussed last week and in other discussions as well. This person is reintroduced, is re-entering society, taking their place amongst the collective. Many of the steps of this process are similar to that of the Korban Pesach, perhaps precisely because this applied to all members of the community and was focused on their full inclusion in this most important religious rite that brought the collective together. Further, while there is concern about purity and the need for isolation, which can indeed serve purposes medically and psychologically, we are more wrapped up with the details of reentry, that is, ensuring that the person afflicted with tzara'at, for whatever reason, is not excluded from the community permanently. Not only that, but each and every person was to be able to achieve this remediation as dictated. What if someone could not afford the various offerings involved in the steps to achieve reentry? That too is accommodated. We learn in Parak Yodaled, chapter 14 of Vayikra, Ve'im dalhu ve'ein yadu mesachet ve'lakach keves echad asam l'tenufa l'chaper alav. But if he's poor and he cannot afford the indicated korbanot, the sacrifices, he will take one male lamb as a guilt offering for waving to exact atonement for him. Ve'asirun salat achad belu b'shemen lemincha v'log shaman. And 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a meal offering, and a log of oil. He will take 2 turtle doves, shtei torim, or 2 young doves, shtei b'nei yonai, according to what he can afford. One may be a chatat, a sin offering, and one may be an olah, a burnt offering. He will bring them, the Metzora, the one who is afflicted with tzara'at, on the 8th day of his cleansing, after the 7 clean days that are counted, to the Kohen, to the entrance of the tent of meeting before God. Let us think about this process. And do we take its intent to heart today? Are we responsive in our own lives to all of the accommodations found in our text to the same degree as we are to the restrictions? I find, especially in the more religiously pitched part of the world, too often, everyone is very into the chumras, very into the restrictions and making them stricter and stricter and stricter. But do we talk about and do we give the same voice to the accommodations? God understood perfection is not attainable in the human world. Do we accept that limitation as well? In the Gemara, there are so many comparisons between the Metzora, the Ovel, the one who is mourning, and the Menuda, the one who has committed heresy and separated themselves from the community, along with others who may be thought to be excluded for one reason or another. Why do we compare these 3 types of people? The Ovel, the mourner, the Metzora, the one with leprosy, and the Menuda, the one who has gone against the conventions of the community and committed some type of heresy. what are they each experiencing as they are relegated to outside of the camp, so to speak? They are experiencing loss of companionship, loss of inclusion, loss of belonging, and the loss of the ability to participate fully in the ongoing life of the community with its rituals. Mitzvot, an ongoing life of observance and celebration, the very glue that helps us maintain a sense of community and belonging, that all that means for everyone's mental as well as societal health. This notion of potential outsiders is expressed time and again in the Gemara, in Masechet Pesachim, Yevamot, Chagiga, Moed Katan, Megillah, and so on. Within this myriad of discussions, the focus is consistently on enabling and ensuring the fullest participation possible of all potentially marginalized members and groupings of our communal society. In Chagiga, we have a precedent for bringing women into the davening communities. In Yevamot, we have precedents for how we release women from the obligation to marry a male relative of their deceased husband if they are childless, and other instances in which women have agency for themselves. We allow people with various impurities to come together and to be part of the community. These accommodations are to teach us something very valuable about how we need to be more embracing and ensure the belonging of all members of our community. Consider what I find to be one of the most amazing teachings from the Gemara. This comes from Masechet Pesachim. In the 7th chapter, Parak Shvi'i, there is an extensive discussion about how we ensure that all members of the Bnei Yisrael can indeed participate in the Korban Pesach. It is in this context that the differentiation of those who are tahor, pure, and those who have some tum'ah, some impurity, is articulated, and how it is ensured that all members of the community ultimately can participate in the Korban Pesach. Percentages of groups with varying tuma'ot, impurities, are mentioned, and the rabbis present different options of how to ensure group inclusion. At one point, it is actually suggested that if just less than half of the group have been subjected to any of these tumot, any of these impurities, and just more than half of the group are tahurim, have not been subjected to these impurities, how do we ensure that the entire group can participate in the Korban Pesach? One solution is to provide a sheretz, some unclean thing, an unclean animal, something that is clearly impure. Think lobster tail or something, I don't know. So that even if one person flips the balance, and now members of the group make up more than half of the group that are in the Tumah category, everyone participates in the Korban Pesach. And the Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach that was made available for these folks, is canceled. Within this discussion on 80a in Masechet Pesachim, we read, everyone agrees that Tum'ah is overridden by community. Community is more important than the individual impurities. In other words, it was so important to facilitate the participation of everyone and not to render anyone as an outsider that various elements of Tum'ah were set aside. And Tum'ah is really important. A lot of Vayikra is talking about it. But we could set it aside to facilitate everyone being considered an insider. This is also evident in discussions about obligations to hear shofar, to be in a sukkah, to hear Megillah on Pesach, offer the Chagiga offering, the holiday offering, and participate in the Jewish community in so many other facets. Sarat, so associated with Miriam and her experience in speaking against Moshe, as we are often taught, becomes a moment for learning for all, as Moshe indicates that they will not move on and continue their journey without his sister, and until Miriam herself is healed from her tzara'at, both on the surface and perhaps internally, as she may come to the realization that when one uses speech to render someone as an outsider, the speaker in this instance becomes the outsider. You malign Moshe, you say bad things, it makes him feel in some way as an outsider. You will have these patches on your skin, visibly making you an outsider. And what do we do in this instance? We exercise compassion and stepping up, as does Moshe when he says we will not move on until Miriam is healed. And it is significant to note that it is Moshe that was wronged by Miriam's speech. When we see this compassion and stepping up of the ones who have been wronged, then the rest of us have even more reason to do so. What an important lesson to be applied in our lives today. When we think of community, who is included? When we think of the fractures in our world, who is not including others? Who is hurting us? There's another indispensable lesson here. Our lives as human beings are all about living on the continuum of pure and impure. These are not static points, but rather moving parts of the complexities and the ongoing reality of our lives. Our law gives us approaches to deal with them through participation in the community and coming together, need for reflection, and sometimes a measured dose of isolation, and then full inclusion afterwards. Is this about outsiders and insiders, or rather, is it about how each of us fall into all of these categories at various points in our lives, feeling the pain and loss of not being included, and thus working harder to ensure inclusion of all to the best of our abilities? That is to say, any one of us who has a visible physical deficit or skin affliction, think poison ivy, eczema, allergic rashes, psoriasis, and so on, knows the feeling of being looked at differently. Some years ago, at a conference I was running on inclusion as part of my work with Eshel and advocating for LGBTQ plus Jews in our Orthodox community, we also addressed other potential outsiders, including those with various physical and mental limitations, women, and others who could be set aside outside of the accepted collective for a variety of reasons. One parent of a profoundly mentally challenged child who was present came up to me afterwards, and I should point out that this was primarily for the Orthodox Jewish community. She shared with me that she was so wrapped up in advocating for her own child, she never thought about these other groups and her responsibility towards all of us as a member of the Jewish community. That would change for her as a result of being present at our conference. As suggested by a second grader in my classes many, many years ago when I was teaching this Parsha, maybe the purpose of the isolation for the Metzora is not for the community, but for the individual to not be hurt or embarrassed, but to focus on their own healing. Now that's a sobering thought. As the Parsha continues, we come across Nida, the separation of women due to their cycles, Zav, Zava, those who have various emissions and skin lesions, the Baal Kiri, the one who emits semen, amplifying the point that all of these experiences are merely part of being human, as are the various differentiations of our lives. While there are lengthy discussions about how we separate from the individual in question, whether an ovel, a mourner, a metzora, one who suffers from tzara'at, or a menuda, one who has done something that requires isolation from the community, after which hopefully they will be rejoined, the real goal of the discussion is how we include as many people as possible as often as possible. And while our Torah law, scripts that inclusion, it is up to us as individual people of compassion. It is up to us as a collective that exudes compassion and justice, following God as Rahmanah, the compassionate one of God's many names, to ensure that it happens fully and completely. Maybe, just maybe, when we read these words at the end of the Parsha, we are being taught a very important concept. V'hizartam et b'nei Yisrael mitumatam v'lo yamutu b'tumatam b'ta'ah et mishganei asher b'tocham. And you will separate the children of Israel from all sources of uncleanliness, of impurity, so they will not die on account of their impurity. They will not defile my sanctuary in their midst. In other words, tahara, purity, ritual purity, internal purity, psychological, emotional, all the best of intentionalities. That is our desired state. And while we will never achieve physical perfection, purity, without blemishes, without mumim, without all these things that can disqualify, we can strive to be the best people we can be through our actions and through our intentions. Clearly, we are referring here to the various physical impurities that are just part of our condition. However, there's a much larger and more daunting challenge, namely, that this lack of understanding does not put community first and show compassion to each individual. And when we don't, that is the most profound tum'ah, impurity of all. Not only that, but consider the damage this exclusion can impart to the individual as well as the community. I'm going to cite the Haftarah that normally is assigned to this Parsha when it's not part of Shabbat HaGadol, Malachim, Bet Perek Zayin. Now there were 4 men stricken with sarat. They were at the entrance of the gate to the camp. And they said to each other, Ma anachnu yoshvim po ad matzanu. Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will come into the community, into the city, with the famine in the city, we'll die there. And if we stay here, we will die. So now, let us go and defect to the Aramean camp. If they spare us, we will live. And if they kill us when we die, we will die. Here we have 4 individuals stricken with sarat. And all that represents, what is their potential solution? To go in the camp? To stay outside of the camp where they're not accepted? Maybe go to another camp. Maybe it'll be better there. Maybe not. But either way, in their minds, the only possibility of being allowed in and not maintaining their status as outsiders is to skip their own context and go over to another camp. Some possibility of being let in, no matter how tentative, is better than knowing that one is an outsider forever. The narrative itself is rather horrible, and these men go on to engage in behaviors that are clearly problematic and not appropriate. Moving from the details of this story itself and just looking at this piece in the beginning of the storm, so to speak, we see that feeling excluded, and we know this, can and often does result in horrible outcomes, especially when the excluded person feels that there is no other choice for them except to leave. What do they have to lose? In my ongoing work with Eshel, in ensuring that our shuls and our rabbis and our communities and our schools are welcoming to our LGBTQ plus wonderful Jewish members of our community, I am always striving to create, to find, help shuls, schools, and communities to include our members. I see and hear such stories of exclusion and loss due to one's sexuality and or gender diversity. When we find places for all in our community, we ultimately will learn lessons that we never could have imagined. The many rabbis and communities that do find wonderful ways to accept and be welcoming have learned exactly this. And for them, no one is relegated to outside of the camp. To achieve such inclusion and validation is the reason I am personally so dedicated to this work and its mission. We have much to learn from each other, and all have what to contribute. And therefore we should include and welcome and encourage all to come inside and belong. Is this not the message of Pesach with our reading about our Aramean beginnings, our different types of children, the lengthy discussions of our learned forebears and their different approaches, the many different foods and what they represent, and so on? Is this not a holiday about inclusion? Is this not what is behind bringing a sheretz, bringing an unclean animal or source in to the community, having people touch it so that the entire community could celebrate, observe, and remember all that Pesach is together as a collective? None of these discussions are about us or them, the insiders and the outsiders, but rather, how do we, honestly, not just in our words, but in our deeds, in our lives, in our actions, intentionally ensure that all of us remain insiders to the greatest degree possible, so that when an individual is rendered what could potentially be considered an outsider, pause is taken and Torah law is remembered. This was clearly the concern of our teachers from long ago. Let our teachers today and all of us remember this as we prepare for this Pesach. I do believe that Rabbi Isaac Bernays, Zichrono L'Shalom, would find this a most appropriate Shabbat HaGadol lesson to consider. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Pesach Kasher V'Sameach, and a reminder that next week I will not be recording a Parshat discussion. We will come back with Acharei, and interestingly enough, after the death of Aaron's sons, but also after Pesach, the following week. Be well all, and I wish all of you an inclusive, a meaningful Pesach where we all feel like we belong as insiders. Lihitraat.